When I started my career, I thought, oh, I'm not a PhD, I'm not an MD, what do I know? And soon after a decade of doing it and being a voracious reader, I think you have to be, really an autodidact to be successful in this business. I realized that I had some non-trivial knowledge of the industry and a lot of muscle memory. And I wasn't intimidated by someone with a certain degree. And I don't think anyone should be, by the way.
Welcome to Money Moves, the show about raising money, making great investments, and building venture scale businesses. I'm Neil Devani, your host and the founder of Necessary Ventures, a firm investing in what the world needs. Each week, we'll talk to folks who have raised anywhere from $10 million up to billions of dollars. We'll learn how they return multiples of 10x to 100x or more to their investors. We dive into their stories, uncovering what worked and what didn't, learning from real experiences to understand the journeys of raising capital and rapidly scaling a business. Money Moves isn't just for those already in the game. It's also for anyone interested in the mechanics of startups and venture capital. Whether you want to raise money, make better investments, or just understand how it all works, Money Moves gives you the insights and advice you need to succeed. So join us each week and hear from those who've been through it all and learn from their journeys. Shahram, thanks so much for joining me for an episode of Money Moves.
Great to be here, Neil. Thank you for having me.
I want to jump right in. You have had an amazing track record that you've built. Can you tell us about, one or two of your best investments by multiple?
Well, without necessarily revealing multiples, what I will say is that one of the investments that we made from the fund that is looking to probably be in the public market in the next couple of years, if not earlier, is a company called Billion to One. It's a diagnostics company you may be familiar with. I was fortunate to have met the founder when I started this fund in 2017. As you may know, I started the fund with a kind of a demonstration fund. It was only $1 million that I raised in a few weeks in 2017 as I was coming out of my last startup, which was a cancer therapeutics company. And I wanted to just see if this whole VC thing is something I would enjoy and if I could get into deals and be more of an institutional investor versus an angel, which is what I was before. So I met the founder of Billion to One, a gentleman named Oğuzhan Atay. It's a Turkish name, who was a Stanford PhD. And I met him when I had started in 2017 with a fund that I was literally working out of a basement. In fact, you'll be familiar with this building. The building I was in San Francisco is where Omada had his headquarters. And I was one of the early angels in Omada. So I was in a basement. It sounds probably worse than it is because the basement was actually quite nice. It was a marketing company that had it. And it was, we're recording here, but it was actually a recording studio. So there was actually a separate booth there with a microphone. Beautiful videographers had their private offices there. Everything was black and chic. I even had a conference room that could seat 20 people with a massive monitor, but it was in the basement. So when Oğuzhan came, I asked him to meet me at the Illy's Cafe on Sansom Street right across. And I did, and he was telling me about the idea, which is essentially a level of precision and fidelity so high when it comes to looking for DNA molecules in blood samples that they could look for any anomaly, including in a mother within the first 10 weeks of gestation of her fetus. They could find any single base pair, single gene disease. So that's traditionally what you would do through a carrier screen, but they were able to do it through a non-invasive prenatal test or an IPT. That is currently what is sitting at the highest multiple of any investment that I've made in life sciences. And hopefully we realize in the next couple of years. But it's also something that I would say is a forever company in the sense that he is just an absolutely unique entrepreneur, one of my favorites. And everything he does is different. And the way he runs the company, the level of rigor in understanding business practices and using the best ones to run what is now a multi-100-person organization and taking it from zero to way north of 100 million revenues in 4 years in a regulated space like diagnostics. That's not trivial. So I'm really humbled to be an investor in Billion to One as their first check kind of in 2017. And we've put in now, tens of millions since then in that company. Again, very humbled to have been able to grow our fund alongside that investment. Now, that was 7 years ago that we made the first investment there. And as you know, as an investor, it's not just a question of multiples, right? Because if you invest in a company and it sells for 3 times your investment in 3 months, that actually is a higher IRR, internal rate of return, than you might get as a multiple. So Billion to One is certainly one of the highest multiples that we have on paper. If you're talking about kind of realized multiples, I've been fortunate to have 15 exits, and there's a lot of them that are north of, that are double-digit multiples that happen in a short amount of time. But I will say this on your question, which is a question that you didn't ask, but I always think about. The multiples you see in tech are pretty different than biotech, at least from my experience. when I see, I don't know if you saw the recent year in review by Atlas Ventures, but Bruce Booth had a beautiful chart where he showed the market cap of Nvidia at 3.4 trillion. And guess what? It equals the market cap of the top 10 pharma, not just biotech, but the top 10 pharma. And Nvidia's revenues are 60 billion, and the revenues of combined top 10 pharma are half a trillion. So it's like, what's happening to multiples? We just don't trade in the life sciences space at the same multiples that tech does. And so it's actually, when you have like a 50x or 100x multiple, and I won't say where my multiple is on that investment, but let's say that's kind of not far off. That's heroic in our space. I think, much more common for a winning investment if you're an investor, not the founder of the company, because many VC firms find, they incubate and they start their own companies. If you're an investor and you can get double-digit multiples in a few years, that's considered really, really good. And of course, the IRR will put you in the top 5% of our investment cohorts. And of course, you're familiar with Rewrite, which is a company that we sold to Intellia in 18 months after being the first and only check in that company, along with one of our LPs that we brought in. That was a huge return on investment within a very short amount of time. 3-4 person team, we sold it for 200 million. So you can imagine what that looked like as well. So sometimes it's not just that the company doesn't need to become on the scale of $1 billion to one, where they're doing hundreds of millions in revenues and they've raised $500 million and they're going to go public. You could have a 3-person team, Neil and 2 of his scientists sitting in a room, and we put in $3 million and we sell it for 200, and that could be the best investment we ever made.
There's a lot of talk, from the AI world of like the 1-person unicorn and very lean teams and being able to build these large companies, but it's happened in biotech and life sciences for a while, right? Just the value of the innovation can be so great in terms of the innovation it creates.
My last company, as you know, I was a founder for a decade before starting the fund. My last company was a company called Insterna, originally called Argenx, but we changed the name. We've now raised 150 million from all the top investors like Novo, Sophie Nova, et cetera. And for the first 7 years when I was running the company, it was like a 5-6 person team, again, sitting in a basement. I think there's something about me in basements, but we were in the basement of the New York City Blood Center, which is a converted school. I mean, it literally was built in the 40s or 50s. It was not sexy space. Fortunately, they had fresh paint, but it was kind of, you wouldn't believe it if you walked into it. You're like, well, I can't believe this is a place where people have biotech offices. But I really actually enjoyed it when I was in New York for a year, raising the first institutional round for that company. And it was just like, the reason we were there is because we had lab space. So the New York City Blood Center had converted the space, and it was very, very useful. And in fact, it was nice space in that regard. Didn't have sexy views or anything like that, but that was like a 5-6 person team for the first 7 years, and still our team is in Asterna is I think less than 25. So in biotech, and I think that'll be hopefully $1 billion plus exit, right? So in biotech, you don't need to have a huge team to develop drugs, because almost all of it is outsourced to CROs in China or here that are doing the formulation work, the GMP. They're doing some of the animal studies, a lot of the animal studies. And that's been a change, I think, in the industry in the last 20, 30 years. You have tremendous scale through using established organizations.
I want to keep talking about your experience in building civilization, but I do feel like it's important for us to backtrack a little and just talk about your path to where you are, in the sense that, I love the fact that you came out of Harvard as a lawyer. You worked in law firms. You said, okay, I want to go do something in finance. You got into banking, and then you became a founder. You had success, real success as a founder before deciding to start a venture firm. Looking back, I imagine this is not the route you originally charted, when you kind of had these pivot points along the way. Is that fair to say?
Well, funny enough, it is. Well, the venture route is not one that I charted, because I would never presume that I'm going to be a VC. That would have been far-fetched for me when I graduated from law school. But even in law school, one of the classes that I took, which was my favorite class in many respects and kind of set the course for me, was called the High Tech Entrepreneur, and it was taught by Larry Lessig and Jonathan Citrain, who are 2 luminaries in the world of law and tech. And that was the first time they were teaching the class together. And it was a beautiful class, because we covered some legal topics around startups. And remember, this is 1998, 1999 when I graduated, which is the height of the dot-com boom. In fact, Professor Lessig was the special prosecutor for the Microsoft antitrust case at the time. And he would, every time one of us would deliberately say, Microsoft, he would leave the room and kind of look at us funny, like, hey guys, stop doing that. I can't keep leaving the room. It became this kind of game that we would play with him. And it was a small class. The class was just probably a few dozen people, unlike some law courses that are huge at Harvard. And I really enjoyed it, because our mandate and our final assignment was to create a business. And we did. So me and two of my classmates started, this is again, 98, 99. We started one of the first online art shops. We called it Artopa. And, I developed a website for it and we started uploading some of my mother's art onto it. And we had a real living, breathing.com. And that was so much fun because there was nothing legal about that. It was actually pure business execution. And I think I really did belong probably more in a joint degree program, maybe an MBA, maybe a master's in biology or something. But going back even further than law school, I came to this country when I was 8 as an immigrant. Neither of my parents went to school or college, and certainly not in this country, but they didn't go to college at all. And so I didn't have that, guiding light of what I'm supposed to do. It was me kind of figuring it out a little bit. And when I was in law school, I had quite a bit of debt coming out, 100,000 in debt coming out of grad school. Today, people graduate with 300,000 and something crazy. But for me, that was a lot of debt. Back then, interest rates were like 9%. So when I graduated, I had this heavy overhang of serious debt that I would have to pay back to my schools. And it definitely tempered my risk-taking appetite. So when I graduated in 99, I actually thought about starting a dot-com business. It was kind of, everyone was doing it. In fact, several of my classmates did. I just didn't have the financial independence to do it. And how am I going to pay the bills? And so I went to Wilson Sonsini, and I thought that was a good idea anyway, so I could learn hard skills. One of the things that I would ask myself is, well, if I join a startup, sure, I'm a 25-year-old kind of energetic guy, but what do I know? I mean, I haven't really done anything. I've been working at school for my whole life. And so I wanted to get hard skills in business and areas that I could work with others who were technical and complement them. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why I stuck around in law and banking for 7 years, not a short amount of time. And it was in some ways a big advantage for me because I learned, through hundreds of financings and M&As and just transactions, learned the ins and outs of a lot of the legal stuff involved in building a company, as well as the financial. But really the reason that drove me to wait a little bit was because I had to pay off my loans. And I wanted to have a savings account and be independent. I didn't ask my father for money, didn't ask anyone else. My parents, I was just standing on my own two legs, and that could cost you time. On the other hand, I think it gave me the advantage of the experience that I had coming into my first startup out of Stanford, where I was actually outside counsel to this company called Next Bio, helped put together the angel round, even helped negotiate the founders agreements. They were amazing founders. And I came in kind of as a founding CFO, if you will. It's like a two-person team, and helped raise. I took charge of the financing, raised the first 20 million with our CEO and the team, hired 50, 60 people. That became my first experience as an operator, really building the team. When I say the founders and team were pretty illustrious, it's not an understatement. Our co-founder of the company went to become the CTO of Illumina. Our investors include the current CEO of Guardant Health. Our advisors went on to start dozens of companies. And that also became a huge part of my network and kind of part of my unfair advantage as an operator in the life sciences when I started the fund. So when I started this fund 7 years ago, I wasn't coming into it cold. I had run multiple companies, multiple software companies. I'd run a therapeutics company. I'd been an angel in companies like Counsel and Avantome and Bina that were sold to Myriad and Illumina and Roche, respectively. And so I had a lot of conviction, some thesis around which I wanted to invest.
So when you got to that point, I guess in 2017, right, you have at this point built and exited multiple companies. You've built a great angel track record. What is the moment that you decide, I need to start a firm, I need to start my own firm?
I laugh when you ask the question because it was a little bit random. I had, as an attorney for several years, I represented venture firms. As an investment banker, didn't really work with venture firms because we were obviously focused more on public companies and CEOs and CFOs. But as an entrepreneur, I had pitched venture firms for a decade. And so all the top firms you see now, I had pitched them. I had pitched those GPs. So, but my familiarity was really being, with the industry, was being on the founder side of the table. Like I kind of understood a little bit what made Third Rock and OrbiMed and Column Group and Atlas and Flagship and Arch and all these guys function because I've been pitching them. And it actually demystified it for me a little bit. So when I started my career, I thought, oh, I'm not a PhD, I'm not an MD. What do I know? And soon after a decade of doing it and being a voracious reader, I think you have to be, really an autodidact to be successful in this business. I realized that I had some non-trivial knowledge of the industry and a lot of muscle memory. And I wasn't intimidated by someone with a certain degree. And I don't think anyone should be, by the way. I just always operated from a first principles perspective. Like I'm going to go learn X, Y, and Z. And then when I didn't know something, I would rely on PhDs and hire them and speak with them and try to understand the science. So why did I start a venture firm? I sat down after I'd run multiple companies in 2017 and said, what can I do for the next 20 years that I would enjoy, that I think would be part of a big growth trajectory, in other words, industry trends, where I also felt like I would have an unfair advantage. And believe it or not, Neil, it was through almost a process of elimination that I came to venture. I thought, well, I'm not going to start another company. I didn't want to have that kind of concentrated risk. My last company, to give you an example, was started in 2010. Okay, it's 2024 and we haven't exited. It's doing phase 2 clinical trials for oncology. I'm very proud of what we're doing. I believe our drugs, at least one of them, will be approved. But 14 years. At some point, you just gotta, so it could be a long slog. And I thought I don't want to do that again. I also, frankly, didn't want to have co-founders. Having gone through the experience, I realized that there were things that I would have done differently in some of these companies, and I couldn't because when you have co-founders, you don't make this decision making is really colored by that. Not that I don't, we work as a team, even in a civilization, but there's no one kind of above me. And I think that's important for me to have kind of the ultimate say if I need to, and to build something with my vision in it. And I thought I don't mind if I'm small, if we don't grow a big fund. I will hire the best people, but I just want to have that level of control. And I also thought, I think even more importantly, the opportunity that I spotted in the industry was one that I had been privy to as a direct witness. And that opportunity, Neil, was that all these big VCs that I mentioned to you that I was pitching, my rejection rate as an entrepreneur from that was 99%. And that's not an exaggeration, because I would pitch 100 VCs, get one term sheet. But I always got a term sheet, knock on wood. And that gave me a lot of confidence that if you just stick to it, you can get something done. But it also identified for me that they're not infallible, that these VCs, the traditional biotech VCs, had tremendous biases. By the way, I'm not faulting them for that. They do what they do really well. But they didn't like young founders. In fact, I really couldn't identify a single example of a young PhD coming out, at the age of 27, 28, and getting a big check from one, like, a Polaris or an Arch, and becoming successful. I didn't know of any examples. Maybe there was one or two, but you're talking about one or two out of thousands. And the reason is that they had a roster of executives they would plug in. A, so they were risk averse. B, and they weren't looking to mentor young people to learn. And B, they didn't want to take that kind of risk. And C, they wanted complete ownership. So, these VC firms had crazy ownership in the investments they made, very, very different than what happens in tech. And I thought, I'm going to change that in our industry. I don't think it's necessary. And there were a couple of examples in our industry where that was the case, where you had, younger founders, and they were very successful. One example is StemCentrx. And I remember hiring one of the MIT guys that had worked at StemCentrx, Javier, and bring him into Argenix, and just and I knew the chief of staff in the company. Today, I know all the founders of the company really well, and one of them is the CEO of one of my companies that we've invested in, and the other I've become friends with. So I have a lot of admiration for what they did at StemCentrx in terms of the ability to run a company independently. And that was one of my several models. Council was another model where I thought, Balaji and Ramji did a really great job of maintaining independence. And in almost every case where that happens, they have to go outside of traditional biotech VCs. So I thought, that's unfortunate. Why don't we change that? Why don't we have a biotech venture fund that has an operator at the helm with PhDs, all the same kind of expertise and phenotype you would find in a traditional biotech firm. But we are going to fund the young founders. We are going to mentor them, so I call it mentor capital. And we are going to hopefully see outsized returns, because why wouldn't we? That's the kind of founder that I was. And I remember facing that bias. So that became kind of my mission, if you will, for Civilization Ventures. That was one of them. The second was that I noticed that traditional biotech VCs were not investing in anything really outside of small molecules and large molecules and kind of Me Too drugs. That was their favorite thing. Again, not faulting them for it. They had a flywheel where they could just take an additional scaffold and a moiety, kind of design around it, create a best-in-class drug. In fact, Bruce's presentation for 2024 from Atlas showed that many of the most successful best-selling statin drugs were best-in-class, not the first-in-class statins. It's a huge category, the best-selling drugs up until recently of all time. Now it's going to be GLP-1s. And so that's what they did. And I thought, I want to invest in AI. I want to invest in next-gen sequencing enabled precision medicine. I want to invest in curative treatments using gene and cell therapies that, as you know, the paper for CRISPR was published in 2012. These were new modalities. It's not as if a big VC firm from 20 years ago has a lot of institutional memory on how CRISPR works or how to do gene editing. So I thought, we're a young guerrilla kind of like, I don't want to use the word guerrilla warfare, but, we have to find an unfair advantage for $1 million seed fund to go out there and win deals, help founders have exits. And I thought, this is going to be it. We're going to go support younger founders and not have that, remove the bias that a lot of the bigger VCs have. And B, we're going after artificial intelligence and digital health. As you know, we were early investors and big investors in Omada and Lemonade Health and many others, Baby Scripts, et cetera. We're going to go after precision medicine, genomics and diagnostics. Diagnostics for a long time has been a dirty word in venture capital and biotech. And we're going to go after curative treatments that are newer modalities. And that became the mission. So I really want to focus on differentiating us on the thesis front as well. And I think we've been enormously fortunate that now we've had a dozen exits through the fund, 3 of which are gene and cell therapy companies. We've had Rewrite sold to Intellia. I was the only board member next to the founder. We were the only investors. Replace sold to Tome. We won't talk about Tome Bio and their recent bankruptcy, but anyway, that was a good exit for us. And again, we were the only investors in that company. And we had Rocket Pharma, where we were privileged to be an early investor in Gorov's company. I was personal friends with him. And that company is one of the best performing gene editing companies now on the market, Rocket Pharma. So that's why I started the fund. That's why the thesis is what it is. And even I'm surprised by where we are today, I would say, in some ways. I didn't expect us to grow this quickly. And I didn't expect us to be fortunate enough to have this many exits this quickly.
Let's go deeper into that. So first fund was just over $1 million. I think you said from last time we talked, you mentioned, you raised it very quickly, which not surprising. I mean, with your track record, with your experience, your network, to raise a small fund, you probably just did it pretty quickly. What was that process like to raise the first fund?
Well, I should mention right now we're managing, 150 million, right? So we've grown a lot in the last 7 years, but our second fund was 35 million. I closed that in 2020. We have an opportunity fund of 34 million that I closed in 2022, 23. And we've largely invested those funds. Now we've already done a huge first close for our third fund that we made four investments from already. And so what was that process like? Again, it was a random walk, I would say. I didn't have, a rich uncle that was going to, by the way, nothing wrong with rich uncles. Power to them, but I didn't have one where that was going to seed my fund. And I also wasn't coming out of another fund. I wasn't coming out of a Kleiner or an OrbiMed where I could just, whisper to those LPs and say, come and fund my new fund, which is what usually happens when people leave those funds. So I was starting from scratch. I did not have relationships among LPs that were meaningful. I knew a lot of angels. I was an angel, but it was completely new to me. And I remember the first conference that I went to, I didn't even have business cards at the time. A random friend of mine invited me to. He said, you should go to Monterrey, Mexico. There's this conference happening at El Tec de Monterrey, which is their technical university there. And, Tim Draper's putting together a plane of people, small VCs, and they're all going. And I thought, I've heard of Tim Draper. I'll do it. And I love Spanish. I speak Spanish, love Spanish. I always wanted to go to Monterrey. So I said, okay, let's go. So I show up and it was like a private plane. Wow. I got to fly. Private plane, and a bunch of us, young whippersnapper wannabe VCs, kind of packed the plane. And I'm sure you've met Tim. Tim's a larger than life personality, very charismatic, really kind of affable guy. I sat next to him for 3 hours on the way back, where he gave a very spirited defense of Theranos. And I tried to persuade him that, I think he was an investor. I tried to persuade him that Elizabeth Holmes was not being picked on because she's a woman. She was being picked on because she's a fraud. but that was like a 2-hour discussion. But I abandoned that. But in Monterey, it was encouraging to see all these young wannabe VCs like myself with, some of them had, much larger funds. I hadn't really raised my fund yet, but it was fun speaking with them. And it just was really the first step in my random walk into raising money. Because at that event, I ended up connecting and bonding with someone named Grace. He's a man, but his name is Grace, and he's a wonderful guy. And he became one of my first LPs. And he represented a much, much larger family office, a very well-known one. But my advice for founders, entrepreneurs, VCs, just get out there. Just get out there, start going to events, start talking to people. You'll be shocked at how penetrant and valuable your network is. And so it was just that, just meeting with people, telling them what I'm doing. I had a business plan. Obviously, I had a very strong thesis. I've been doing this for a while, and I would show people that. But again, raising $1 million fund is not really a big deal, vis-a-vis what I'm doing today. But it was the first step, and I deliberately didn't want to raise a bigger fund. I didn't want to be in a position where I had to kind of worry about the fund. I thought, this is a small amount. I obviously put my own capital into it as well, and I thought, let me just demonstrate what we can do. And that fund has been wildly successful. I mean, I think it's. The metrics are kind of off the charts for that fund. And we were fortunate that I invested that in 20 companies, of which 4 have become unicorns. and one of them, Aspect Bio, just raised another round. I don't know if they've announced it yet, but they've signed a $2.6 billion deal with Novo Nordisk for metabolic cell therapies. So those are the kinds of companies that I was fortunate to invest in from that $1 million seed fund. And it really became the genesis of what I'm doing now.
Those LPs are very happy with that first fund. It
I
sounds
hope
like.
so.
How many people did you have to pitch to get to how many LPs for $1 million?
I don't think I pitched more than a dozen LPs
That's not bad.
to raise that. But I will say that in the beginning of the fundraising for my funds, the rejection rate, again, probably started in the 90s because I just hadn't done it before. Even my deck, I refined dramatically. And this is, again, more advice for entrepreneurs. You have to be iterative in whatever you're doing. It's not just related to your product. You have to be iterative in what you're doing with your deck. And this is one thing that I really impress upon our founders as well is, take your deck seriously because it is the material you're presenting to someone in addition to your in-person presentation. And if you have a phenomenal technology, but you're talking to what normally is probably someone that's not deep in that technology as an investor, you have to be able to educate them. And the burden is on you, not on them. Just pretend they're not that smart. And how you convey that is going to be impacted by what the graphics look like in your deck, what the flow is, what the messaging is, the density of text. All these little things end up becoming big things. And to give an example, I won't name the company, but one of our companies that's one of the most successful companies we've invested in, I sat down with the founder and I said, I understand what you're doing because I'm in this space, but your deck sucks. It's like, you've raised the first 2-3 million. You need to go raise a lot more. This deck's not going to do it because you're not conveying the kind of revolutionary step function movement that your technology presents to the industry. And I introduced him to his marketing team, his graphics. I helped him rework the deck, and that company has been wildly successful because they internalized this idea that marketing matters, that how you communicate matters, storytelling matters. These things are important. There's a book that I recommend called The 3-Minute Rule. It's a funny book. It's written by a Hollywood executive, but it really forces you to understand what it is you're trying to communicate. And you should be able to condense. Your pitch should be 3 minutes. It should be like 5-10 slides. And if that person is not close at the end of that, they are not going to be close, period. You're never going to close them. So this is the kind of stuff that I learned. Of course, we have, for example, in our current fundraise, we have a 20-slide deck, but then we have a 60-slide, 70-slide deck, which is fully loaded with all kinds of data. But you kind of need both. You kind of need the density and the richness and the complexity of, a diligence-based deck and a story, but you also need to be able to just get people excited. So my deck was initially kind of my business plan, but I did put it in a deck format, and I hired a graphic designer because already then I'd been an entrepreneur for 10 years and I'd been successful raising money, and I'd been successful because I took seriously storytelling and translating for lay investors what we do in biotech. And I took that, and it's funny, I don't think you've seen my deck, but some of my slides are very foundational. I have one slide which shows the history of biotech. I came up with it because I thought if I'm a layperson, I want to understand what is the context of biotech. I begin with Darwin, 1850, and then I go to Mendel when he came up with what he was doing, and then I have a couple more points along the graph that show the kind of advancements that have been made, and then I end it with CRISPR. Since I've added the pandemic as well, it's kind of one of the.
There's a lot that's happened since CRISPR. There's a lot of interesting things to add in the last 10 years.
It has to, but again, remember this particular slide is meant to educate people at the 30,000 foot level, looking down on the world of biotech, and why is this moment today that we're in so important. In fact, I'm going to open it, just look at it in front of me so I can give you the exact things that I had on it, because I was proud of that slide because it was, again, kind of a layman's. The idea was to educate lay people on what it is that we do and make sure that they understand the gravity of the moment that we find ourselves in biotech today, which is a non-trivial moment. So I have one chart. I have two of these charts. I'm looking at it now. One of them shows how the movement in tech since the 2000 era has kind of mirrored in some ways what's been happening. In biotech has mirrored in some ways what happened in tech when you had, personal computers in the 70s, and then the internet, and then the one that I talked about, where I talked about natural selection in 1859, then loss of inheritance by Mendel in 1865. Then I go to the discovery of DNA in 1944, double helix discovered in 1953, human genome mapped in 2000. first synthetic organism in 2010, then CRISPR in 2012, and then CRISPR-based human trials is where I ended on that particular slide where I talk about the evolution. Again, very selective things that I just plucked from the history of biotech, but I'm trying to convey to folks, at least my stakeholders, that we are in a very special moment in biotech. Like when people say that this is the century of biology, obviously it's the century of everything, right? I mean, all things are converging. Clearly, it's the century of AI, but it is indeed the century of biology in the sense that if you think about the difference between humans and chimpanzees, we're 1.5% difference in terms of the DNA. Almost all the genes are the same. Everything looks very similar. 1.5%. And does anyone doubt that with the advent of AI and CRISPR and gene editing, we're not going to improve humanity's gene pool by 1.5%? And it's going to be a lot more than that. So I actually, this goes beyond my thesis as an investor, of course, because that stuff's not going to happen in the next 10 years. But fundamentally, we're at the base of an era which will eclipse everything that's happened in human history, really, when it comes to how biology is used. And that's kind of what gets me excited about biology and why I'm doing what I'm doing. The immediate application of that is very, direct things that we're working on, like cancer detection using NGS, or genetic engineering to do ex vivo, in vivo cell therapies, gene edits that are able to be curative. Those things are the immediate applications. But if you think about all of these technologies and extrapolate, they're going to impact a lot more than just curing disease. And that gets me excited. And so our deck deals with that as well. So I would listen at every meeting to what questions our prospective LPs would ask and what they were getting excited about and what they were not getting excited about. And I would iterate literally that night. I think I iterated my deck in 2017, 2018, 2020, at least 500 times. I mean, I went in there, made fundamental edits at least 500 times. And the deck that I'm using today for the new fund, I've done the same thing with, even though we already had a foundation for it. I actually kind of started the exercise from scratch again. And I'm just conveying all that because you asked the question about how I went about doing it. I was very iterative. I treated the fund like a minimum viable product. Obviously, I was in the tech world, so the whole MVP, kind of lean startup mentality was one that I had lived with and incorporated into my own startups. And when I started the fund, I treated it exactly the same. I thought, I'm going to start lean. I'm going to have an MVP, which is $1 million seed fund, and I'm just going to see where it goes, and then I'm going to build on that. And in retrospect, I believe that was a fortuitous decision, a good decision, because I didn't spend 2 years raising a fund.
Yeah, you're very quick.
Yeah, I don't think I would have been successful because I didn't have an institutional track record. And I would have just been a guy going out there raising money. Second of all, I wouldn't have enjoyed it. I enjoy working with founders. I enjoy making investments, watching things grow. I don't enjoy just pitching all the time so I could raise a mega fund and make mega fees. That was not my goal. My goal was to have an impact. My goal was to do something where immediately I could make a difference and where I could help people. I wish that I would have had a mentor like I strive to be for my founders when I was a founder, because in some ways it was like a blind walk and it was difficult. Frankly, it was way more difficult to raise money 20 or 10 years ago than it is today. And even we're in a down market. Again, referring to one of Bruce's slides on his year in review, the amount of capital now is like 3 times what it was 10 years ago. It's crazy how much more capital is out there. And we're in a down market. So now the name of the game for founders is much more, I think, around focus because the capital is there for them. And I want to be able to help founders who would listen, avoid things that I'd seen done wrong and do the things that I'd seen done right.
What are some of those other points of wisdom, like the things that you've had to learn the hard way and you try to impress upon founders? Obviously, having a deck that people can read quickly and understand something unique, even if they're not experienced in your field, is a big one. Are there other things in that realm or just generally strategy and tactics?
Sure. Not being enamored with your biases or what you think the product should be when you're doing digital health, and really focusing on where the demand is for the product that should be built. Not overvaluing your company early and putting yourself in a position where you're not going to be able to live up to that valuation and you have to do a down round. This is something that I was preaching heavily 3 years ago in 2021 because it was clear to me, and I was on record on various podcasts saying that we were in a bubble. And a few founders ignored my advice and were like, no, well, we're a $100 million company because this family office gave us that valuation. And I said, well, that $5 million is not going to get you far. You're going to have to raise 50. And those founders are having a hard time.
Do you think we're in a bubble now with AI or generally?
Yes. Yeah. AI is a bubble, but biotech is so anchored in the reality, if anything, undervalued public and private markets that if a little bit of AI froth bleeds into it, it's counterbalanced by the lack of profit in biotech. So I don't think biotech suffers from that. I think tech investments certainly appear to be suffering from it. I'm not a tech investor, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But from what I've kind of seen, there was one index that someone told me about where, or rather that I read about, which was, I believe, the earnings of the top companies as a ratio. Oh no, I'm sorry, the aggregate market cap of the U.S. S&P or something versus the GDP, and we're out of whack. And this is why Warren Buffett is basically sitting in cash. And he's not an investor you should ignore. So I do think that there's a lot going on in the public markets and in AI that's frothy, but not in biotech.
When you're talking to founders who are raising money for the first time, what's your advice on, or for the second time, what's your advice to them on building relationships with investors when they're not raising versus only talking to investors when they're raising?
That's a good question, Neil. I think that it's important first of all, for founders to be likable and not like play too many games with investors, because at the end of the day, you want people to just like you and not think that you're always trying to game them or sell them. I don't think that it's a good practice to schmooze all the time with investors because you could exhaust them. However, it is important to be known by them and to have some presence. If I had to choose where a founder spends her time, between like schmoozing a lot and just building, they should build. The reality is that when you're fundraising, if you know what you're doing, you can run a very tight process. You can initiate it on, let's say February 1, and you should close it April 1, and you should put together a roadshow, so to speak, where you go out to all the investors in a concentrated 3-week period, create a lot of demand, have everyone moving along at the same pace, and then close it. That's the ideal scenario. And so if you're always talking to investors, like, what does that mean? I mean, you should really be raising money when you're doing a process around the fundraise. Having said that, some fundraisers happen differently. Sometimes people just, have a meeting of the mind with an investor they meet, and the guy, the man or woman is like, okay, I want to put in your first $5 million. You don't need to do a roadshow, and that could be a quick shortcut. So there's value in that. But I've seen some founders just schmooze nonstop and just waste time, and at that point you exhaust your audience. I mean, it's better to episodically be present at conferences and get to know people and just be, nice person, like, oh, nice to meet you. I'll let you know when we're raising. And then when you're raising, get everyone on the same page immediately so that you're moving a process forward. Then it is just constantly be, pinging people and say, hey, let's just have a meeting. I'm not raising right now, but let's have a meeting. If you're not raising, then it's a waste of both of our time. So there's just kind of a fine balance. There's no straight answer to it, but I would say, don't spend more than 5% of your time meeting with investors when you're not raising, because you should be spending all your time building. That is what is going to determine your next financing.
Yeah, that's where the value comes from, right? It's not from the art of fundraising. We've got a couple minutes left. I want to make sure we get through our little lightning round we had at the end here. A couple of fun questions. First one, what food would you eat if you could only eat one food for the rest of your life?
Persian food.
Okay, fair enough. What's the hardest lesson you've had to learn in your career?
Oh, wow. I think the hardest lesson that I've learned is to forgive.
That's a really good one.
If someone does something that you don't like and you feel wronged by it, I mean, there's a place for justice and all that. But if we're just talking about normal interpersonal things between founders and investors, etc., don't hold a grudge. It's like one of my friends told me, anger is drinking poison thinking the other person is going to get sick. It doesn't help you. What you should do is be constructive. I try to learn lessons. When I feel like someone did something that I didn't like, or maybe I made a mistake, first of all, I try to apologize immediately if I think I ever did anything wrong. That's one of my mantras. Is I'm not proud about telling someone like, sorry, I stepped on your foot. I'll tell them that if I feel like I did. Not everyone. I mean, I would say most people don't do that, unfortunately, and don't depend on them to do that. Just learn your lesson and move on. And one thing that I do is I write down my lessons. If I come out of an experience and something was difficult, or I feel like I learned something important, or maybe it was a great experience and I learned something, I write it down so that I remember it. And I make sure that those lessons inform me so that hopefully tomorrow I'm a better person than I am today. I'm better at what I do. I'm a better investor. I'm a better mentor. I'm a better husband. I'm a better father. But all these things I try to improve. I try to be deliberate about it and intentional. But I think a foundational step in all of that is knowing to forgive.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. 2 more questions. What's been the best moment of your career so far?
I will say best moments. Honestly, I'm so humbled every time an investor takes a leap of faith and invests in my fund, because I know how hard it is to raise money. And when you're raising a fund, you're basically asking for a blank check. You don't even, the product, I guess, is the thesis, but it's harder than it is raising money in the early days for a startup. And the latter days could be easier. But I just feel grateful every time a founder allows us to invest and, be part of their journey. Every time an investor invests in our fund, I truly feel grateful because I know how hard it is. I know what it's like to have a 99% rejection rate when you're raising money for a disruptive technology in bio. When I was raising money for Next Bio, it was basically a search engine for genomics data. We're doing a search engine to look at information coming off of NCBI, Array Express, normalizing it with our scientific team, making it available literally on a search engine that we had publicly available. We also had a private version. And it was very disruptive, and most investors hated it. It was software. No one wanted to touch it. When I was raising money for Argenix, which is now called Insterna, we were like four founders who had never done it before. Actually, five founders who became four. One of them kind of dropped out. And, people were just very dismissive, and it was very, very difficult. So when someone takes a bet on you, when someone has a meeting of the minds, that's a real occasion to be grateful. And just to take a moment and say, oh man, I'm so lucky. Doesn't matter if it's a small check. It's just a big, so I celebrate those little things. And for me, it's all those moments. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good collection. Last question for you. Who has helped you the most in your career?
That's an interesting question. I would honestly say my family, because I feel like without the love that family gives, you're kind of on your own. You're in this, it's, everything. This is, we're talking about our careers, right? We're not talking about this is a career. So it's very, very important, but there are more important things as well. And those more important things obviously are family and love. And without the foundation of my parents, the sacrifices they made, or my identical twin brother always being supportive and not being judgmental, or of course, more recently, my wife, it wouldn't be worth doing any of this. I would say that, for me, having found a partner and getting married was a really big accelerator in some ways as well, because I just feel like it stabilized things in the personal realm that made it even easier to execute professionally. And that's something that I would recommend to people. I mean, I was a late bloomer. I got married in my 40s, but I would say that don't be afraid to find your partner earlier if you feel like you're ready, because I think stability in that realm is the foundation will help you in your career. So I feel very fortunate for that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we'll leave it there. Shahram, thank you so much for the time.
Neil, I want to thank you for everything you do in our industry. You're one of the nicest people, one of the smartest people that I know. And I really enjoy speaking with you. And I think that I'm really excited for what you'll do in this industry, what you'll continue doing in our industry as well.
Thank you, Shahram. Thank you.
Thanks again for tuning in to this episode of Money Moves. If you learned something new or just loved this episode, click below to subscribe. See you next week.